Hello and welcome to Empire of Wargames. My name is Plesh and today we are going to talk about White Dwarf chapters and indices and if they are really a good idea and if they add something to the Space Marine chapters and to Warhammer 40k in general. If you enjoy the content, consider leaving a thumbs up, subscribing, as well as checking the links down in the description below. Alright, let's get into the video. Alright, so if you've been keeping up with Warhammer 40k and ideally the White Dwarf magazine, which we are going to mainly talk about here, you probably know that White Dwarf is releasing magazines each and every month, and some of them include indices for Space Marine chapters. Some obscure Space Marine chapters, they are getting new rules, they get existing chapter tactic combinations, and yeah, but they get additional relics and warlord traits and so on to make them a little bit more special. Some indices even contain character models and specific, named characters for your army. So there's a lot to talk about. So let's go over it. All right, so I'm not exactly a White Dwarf veteran. I haven't been keeping up with it for a very long time. I always knew it existed. I knew it existed 10 years ago. But the additional rules and whatever else they included wasn't really worth my time because I was playing Necrons and yeah, there were really no rules and additions for me except for a couple of lore bits, and those I just, heard from friends who were actually subscribed to White Dwarf and so on, and they were talking about it and it wasn't enough for me. But as it stands, the White Dwarf is adding a lot more stuff to their magazine, and the Index Astartes is, I think, a great idea to expand on Space Marines and ideally also on other species like, you could offer Necron dynasties, you could offer Orc clans, and so on. There's a lot of potential here, and it doesn't always need to be Space Marine related. So generally speaking, I haven't been keeping up with White Dwarf for a very long time. I always knew it existed. I knew it existed 10 years ago. But back then I was a Necron exclusive player, and as we all know, Necrons didn't get too much exposure in the White Dwarfs. There were lore bits here and there, but I usually heard them from friends who were subscribed to the White Dwarf, and that was generally enough for me, and I didn't really need more of the White Dwarf because it's also a expensive magazine. It costs €9 as it stands, I think 7 or 8 pounds, and back then it was expensive as well, although I think it was a little bit cheaper. Now, ever since 9th edition, and ever since the time I've been keeping up, which is roughly 12 months, the White Dwarf has been releasing Index Astartes and Index Hereticus steadily. We are getting additional rules, we are getting rules for more obscure chapters, and for people who, might be picking up a new Space Marine army and want to play a little bit something different compared to the popular second founding chapters or one of the widely played first founding chapters. So if you are more into obscure chapters, the White Dwarfs are really something to keep an eye on, especially now because they're offering transfer sheets, and that makes actually taking those armies and their paint jobs to the table way easier than freehanding everything or, paying obscene amounts of money for, additional transfer sheets, which are handmade basically. So yeah, the White Dwarf is actually expanding, which is very interesting for me at least. So let's talk a little bit about if the Index Astartes is really something they should continue with, if it's a good addition, and yeah, what could be improved. So generally speaking, the Index Astartes it's a nice thing to have. It doesn't bother anyone because usually the rules are not very competitive. The rules in the Index Astartes are usually successor chapter rules, which means you are getting 2 chapter tactics, which are basically forced on the chapter. So if you're Tomb Keepers, you're getting Indomitable and Bolter Fusillades, or however you pronounce that. And it's basically set. You can't change that. And yeah, it's not a very strong combination, but it's also cool to have a set chapter tactic for a specific chapter that is more obscure. And that's why no one really cares that they exist, and a couple of people who really like their paint scheme, their lore, or their transfers can just pick them up, paint them, and have a cool army to go. And that would drastically change, I think, once we will get an Index Astartes that is accidentally competitive. I can't wait to see the reaction from the competitive 40k Reddit and so on, because I would really like to see how they react to a really competitive Index Astartes for a really obscure chapter that no one really saw coming. But as it stands, no one is too bothered, they're not competitive, and they're just a cool flavor dump and a cool lore dump for obscure Space Marine chapters. Now, the problem here is that the Index Astartes is obviously called Index Astartes, so it's focused on Space Marines, but I wish we would get other factions as well. The only thing I have seen so far was the Index Hereticus with the Fallen, and those rules didn't come across, very well. The rules were not that great, and Fallen players are, as far as I know, sorely disappointed by what was in that White Dwarf. But generally speaking, an Index Hereticus is a good idea. I think Renegade chapters could receive their own rules, and I think they could be a little bit more special than just, pick successor traits and be done with it. It's cool to have your own system to build your own chapters in the codex, but having something written down with specific lore for your cool, small, obscure chapter is really cool. I personally collect Silver Templars, and I have made a whole Silver Templars week focusing on them, and I really like, just collecting smaller chapters and having a little more focus on them, just to, draw a little bit of attention away from Ultramarines and Dark Angels and Blood Angels, because those popular chapters are getting a ton of books, they get a ton of exposure, but there is so much more creativity to go around in Warhammer 40k, and I really think that the White Dwarf emphasizes that when the Index Astartes. And I really wish that was the case for other factions as well. I think other Orc clans or Necron dynasties would really add to the variety and would make the player base genuinely happy. Generally speaking, I understand that Space Marines are the most widely played faction, and thus a lot more people will be interested to pick up a White Dwarf because of new Space Marine rules or new Space Marine transfer sheets. But ever since 9th edition and the Indomitus box, I think there are enough Necron players to warrant additional dynasties and maybe even cool transfer sheets to go along with them in different colors, maybe from the ones we see in Necron boxes today. I think Orcs are also a very popular faction, and Tau as well. And I don't even need to talk about Chaos and Death Guard, because there's so much creativity that could be put into those Index Astartes, Hereticus, or Xenos to just, offer more rules, more variety. And I think it's just a good idea to have other factions represented as well. The one thing I'm not a big fan of is that some chapters have their lore spread out across multiple White Dwarf magazines. And I don't think that's a good idea. The Tomekeepers, for example, were present in 4 White Dwarfs, I think, and it's just a little bit too much. I think having everything concise is a better idea. Thankfully, wikis and other lore-focused pages on the internet focus on really keeping all of that together, but having one chapter with their index and their additional rules and their lore in one White Dwarf would be a more elegant solution, especially considering that, not everyone wants to carry around a lot of White Dwarfs. On the other hand, you also just need the White Dwarf that includes the rules. So it's a give and take. I wish that the Tomekeepers had all of their lore and their rules in one White Dwarf. That's basically the gist of it. Lastly, I agree that Index Astartes and additional rules and White Dwarf rules shouldn't be the most competitive choice out there, but I also think that the rules writers could amp up the competitive scale a little bit, because most of the Index Astartes feel like Crusade chapters, and they are really not competitive at all. Some have a couple of more interesting rules. I think Silver Templars are definitely one of the stronger Index Astartes chapters. But generally speaking, I think they could amp it up by a couple percent just to make them a little bit more interesting for, competitive players to tinker around with, and maybe find a combination that works, in a very specific way. I always like, theory crafting and putting different lists together, and I don't think that the Index Astartes really enables you to do that. All right, so to sum this up, I think I read that there are some Index Xenos, or that they have been present a little bit before I started caring about the White Dwarf. So if you know anything about that, I would be interested to read how those indices went. Are they good? Were the rules competitive? And was there a lot of lore attached to those sub-factions or even factions? And how did it go there? And a similar question would raise for Age of Sigmar, because I know there's also a similar thing to the Index Astartes for different Age of Sigmar races and factions. So I would be interested to hear what is going on the Age of Sigmar side of things. I've been keeping up with all of the obscure chapters from the White Dwarfs because I find them more interesting than the first founding chapters. There are a lot of experts on those, so if you want to read up on them, there are wikis, there are YouTube channels focusing solely on a specific chapter. But I personally like the slightly more obscure chapters, and especially Ultima founding chapters a little bit more. So if you have any questions regarding any of the White Dwarf chapters or any of the White Dwarf rules, feel free to ask. And if you have anything to add to the conversation, feel free to comment. And yeah, we'll just chat a little bit about the White Dwarf, additional rules, and lore for obscure chapters and sub-factions for 40k, and which factions and races would deserve additional sub-factions to be a little bit more fleshed out. Alright, thank you so much for listening. I see you in the next video. Bye bye.